On October 16, 1962, President John F. Kennedy was handed a set of photographs. They were grainy, black and white, taken from 70,000 feet by a U-2 spy plane. To an untrained eye, they showed nothing, just fields and trees in the Cuban countryside. But to the CIA analysts who examined them, they showed the beginning of the end of the world. Soviet nuclear missiles. In Cuba, 90 miles from American soil. For the next 13 days, a handful of men in Washington and Moscow would hold the fate of humanity in their hands. This is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. A world divided. To understand how missiles ended up in Cuba, you have to understand the world of 1962. The Cold War was at its peak. The United States and the Soviet Union, two superpowers armed with enough nuclear weapons to erase each other, were locked in a global struggle for dominance. There was no direct war. There couldn't be. A direct war meant nuclear annihilation for both. So they fought everywhere else. Through proxies, through espionage, through a terrifying arms race, each side building bigger bombs and faster missiles. But there was an imbalance. The United States had nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, close enough to strike Moscow in minutes. The Soviets had nothing comparable near American soil. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev wanted to level the playing field. And in Fidel Castro's Cuba, he saw his chance. Why Cuba? In 1959, Fidel Castro had seized power in Cuba and aligned his revolution with the Soviet Union. To the United States, this was a nightmare, a communist state 90 miles from Florida. In 1961, the U.S. tried to fix it. The CIA backed an invasion by Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs. It was a catastrophic failure. The invasion collapsed within days, humiliating Kennedy and pushing Castro even closer to Moscow. Castro was now certain the Americans would try again, next time with the full force of the U.S. military. He wanted protection. Khrushchev offered it. Soviet nuclear missiles, stationed in Cuba, that would make any American invasion suicidal. For Khrushchev, it solved two problems at once. It protected his Cuban ally, and it placed Soviet nuclear weapons within striking distance of nearly every major American city. In the summer of 1962, the missiles began to arrive. In secret. Discovery. The photographs. But here's the thing. You can't hide a nuclear missile base from a spy plane. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flew over western Cuba and photographed something alarming: the unmistakable construction of medium-range ballistic missile sites. When the photos reached Kennedy on October 16th, the reaction was disbelief, then dread. These weren't defensive weapons. They were offensive nuclear missiles capable of striking Washington, D.C. in roughly 5 minutes. Cities across the eastern and central United States were suddenly within range. Kennedy assembled a secret group of advisors, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as ExComm. For the next week, they would meet in secret, debating how to respond while the rest of the world had no idea how close it stood to catastrophe. The debate: hawks and doves. Inside ExComm, the divide was immediate and severe. The military leaders, the hawks, wanted decisive action. Airstrikes to destroy the missile sites, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force chief, pushed hard for bombing. To him, anything less was appeasement. But Kennedy hesitated. And his hesitation may have saved millions of lives. Because here's what the hawks didn't fully grasp. An attack on Cuba risked killing Soviet personnel. That could trigger a Soviet response, perhaps against the American missiles in Turkey, perhaps against Berlin. And once the missiles started flying, no one could stop them. Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara pushed for a different approach: a naval blockade. Surround Cuba with U.S. warships and stop any more Soviet weapons from arriving. It bought time, It avoided the first shot, and it put the next move in Khrushchev's hands. On October 22nd, Kennedy went on national television and revealed the crisis to the world. He announced a quarantine of Cuba. The world held its breath. The blockade, eyeball to eyeball. The blockade went into effect on October 24th. Soviet ships carrying more military equipment steamed toward the line of American warships. This was the moment. If a Soviet ship refused to stop, would the Americans fire? And if they fired, would it start the war? Then, at the last moment, the Soviet ships stopped. Some turned around. Secretary of State Dean Rusk famously said, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." But the crisis was far from over. Because while the ships had stopped, the missile sites already in Cuba were still being completed. And they were getting closer to operational every hour. The darkest day, October 27th. October 27th, 1962, later called Black Saturday, was the day the world came closest to nuclear war. That morning, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed. He was the only combat death of the entire crisis. The Hawks demanded immediate retaliation. The plan had always been clear. If a U-2 was shot down, the U.S. would strike back. Kennedy was under enormous pressure to launch the invasion. But there was something even more dangerous happening that no one in Washington knew about. Beneath the waves near the blockade line, a Soviet submarine, B-59, was being hammered by American depth charges meant to force it to surface. The submarine had lost radio contact with Moscow. Its crew, exhausted and terrified, believed war might already have begun. And the submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. The man who said no. To launch that nuclear torpedo, 3 officers aboard B-59 had to agree. The captain wanted to fire. A second officer agreed. War, they believed, had started above them. But the third officer, Vasili Arkhipov, refused. Arkhipov argued they should surface and await orders rather than start a nuclear war on assumption. He held his ground against 2 senior officers in a sweltering, oxygen-starved submarine. His single decision stopped the launch of a nuclear weapon that could have triggered a full nuclear exchange between the superpowers. One man, one word. The world never knew how much it owed him until decades later. This is the recurring truth of the Cold War. Again and again, the apocalypse was prevented not by systems or treaties, but by individual human judgment in the worst possible moment. The secret deal. While the military edged toward catastrophe, a quieter conversation was happening behind the scenes. Robert Kennedy met secretly with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrinin. The message was an offer. If the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, the United States would publicly promise never to invade Cuba. And there was a second part, a secret part. The U.S. would also remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey. But this could not be made public. It had to look like a Soviet retreat, not a mutual trade. If it looked like Kennedy had caved, it would weaken him and the NATO alliance. Khrushchev, who was just as terrified of nuclear war as Kennedy, accepted. On October 28th, Radio Moscow announced that the missiles would be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. The crisis was over. The world exhaled. The aftermath. What changed? The Cuban Missile Crisis changed everything. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev had stared into the abyss, and both were shaken by how close they'd come. The near catastrophe led directly to the first concrete steps to control the nuclear arms race. A direct hotline, the famous red telephone, was established between Washington and Moscow so the 2 leaders could communicate instantly in a crisis and avoid the deadly delays of 1962. In 1963, the 2 superpowers signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the first arms control agreement of the Cold War. It was a small step, but it was the beginning of the slow, fragile process of pulling back from the edge. For Khrushchev, the crisis was politically fatal. His retreat was seen by hardliners in the Soviet leadership as a humiliation, and it contributed to his removal from power 2 years later. The real lesson, beneath the surface, the real story of the Cuban Missile Crisis isn't about missiles or politics. It's about how fragile our survival really is. The world didn't avoid nuclear war in 1962 because of brilliant strategy or foolproof systems. It survived because a handful of frightened men, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and an unknown submarine officer named Arkhipov, each chose restraint at the moment when aggression would have been easier. That's a chilling thought. The most catastrophic decision in human history was never more than one order away. And the only thing standing between us and the end was human judgment. Fallible, pressured, and terrified. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a reminder that in the nuclear age, survival can come down to a single person, in a single moment, choosing not to pull the trigger. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the Cold War came to going hot. But it wasn't the only time. In 1983, a single Soviet officer would face an almost identical choice. And once again, the fate of the world would rest on one man's judgment. That's the story in our next video. Make sure to subscribe to Epic Insight and hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. And let us know in the comments, what other hidden history should we uncover next? Thanks for watching.